My name is Jeff Halper, and I'm the, I'm kind of in between things right now, but I've been the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions for many years, which is an Israeli political organization that fights the occupation, but also is trying to advocate for a just peace, whatever that means. That's another lecture. But over the years, you know, working on the occupation, there was sort of a question in the back of my mind that got stronger and stronger over time. And that is, how does Israel get away with this? We're talking about almost 50 years of occupation, a brutal occupation, a form of colonialism, you know, 60 years after the end of colonialism, or most colonialism, violations of human rights, violations of international law, in defiance of dozens of UN resolutions, even against government policies here. I mean, in principle at least, the Belgian government, the EU, the Americans are all in favor of a two-state solution that we know is gone, but at least in principle they're against occupation. The Roadmap Initiative of Bush was against occupation. So the question is, how does Israel maintain its occupation? And I think things are changing on the ground in civil society, but still among governments, including your government here, support for Israel is just as high as it always was. And so the question is why? That began to be a question I wanted to ask. And the usual explanations didn't really explain it for me. You know, the Jewish lobby, the influence of, okay, AIPAC in the US has a certain influence. There's a whole discussion of how much influence, but AIPAC is influential, but it doesn't run the United States. You know, but AIPAC doesn't have much, you know, the Jewish community in let's say, Poland, which is super pro-Israel, or India, or China, or Nigeria, that have become super pro-Israel de facto over the years. They don't have Jewish communities. Well, then people talk about guilt over the Holocaust. Well, that might have some influence in Germany, and maybe in Holland, where Anne Frank is the national industry. But that doesn't matter in the US. The Americans don't even know there was a Holocaust. You know, they don't know those things. Well, then you could talk about Christian Zionists, the Christian fundamentalists. Okay, they have a certain role in the US, again, in the Republican Party. In Canada, when Harper was Prime Minister, who was an avowed Christian Zionist. In Holland, there's a strong Christian Zionist tradition, but that doesn't explain most countries in Europe or other places. So all these explanations that people just bring up about why Israel gets the support it gets doesn't really explain. Certainly not at a government level. And I always had in mind also this phrase of Henry Kissinger, our friend Henry, who used to say that countries don't have friends. They have interests. So I started to look, what is the interest here? What is the elephant in the room that we're not seeing that can explain the support that Israel gets internationally for this occupation? What's the quid pro quo? So all the time I was looking down at the occupation. House demolitions, land expropriation, you know, settlements, everything going on. I said, what if I looked up at Israel's place in the bigger world to begin to see what is Israel's relation to the rest of the world? And how can I explain the support that it gets? And more, of course, the contact would be a military security, kind of an exporting. Because it became clear to me over time that the Palestinians were not the actual targets of the Israeli military. You know, you can't explain last summer's, or the 2014, the attack on Gaza, this disproportionate attack on Gaza, in military terms. In other words, these missiles or these rockets that Hamas was shooting cannot explain the tremendous military force that Israel used on Gaza. We're talking about you know, like the attack on Iraq, like a conventional war. I mean, Israel carpet bombed Gaza with artillery from its navy, you know, F-16s, you know, which are major warplanes, laser-guided missiles, tanks, artillery, drones, of course. I mean, a whole, and ground troops with all the power, you know, of their weaponry against Gaza, you know, against a people with no army who are throwing, okay, some rockets, but not doing much damage, and certainly not justifying that kind of attack. Something else was going on. And it began to occur to me more, and to other people, that in fact the occupied territory is a laboratory for testing and developing new weapons. And the Palestinians are in the end the guinea pigs that you experiment on. They're not the targets, they're not the end users of all this military. They're simply the ones you try your weapons or your surveillance systems, security systems on for export. So it seemed to me then that Israel's major export is the occupation. All the different aspects of occupation, from the weapon systems that it develops to surveillance systems. I mean, you've got 600 checkpoints in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. Well, they're all manned by companies. One of the major Israeli surveillance companies is called NICE Systems. How's that for a name company? NICE Systems. That's one of the world's leaders in creating digital security for cities that link police and security and the cameras and all kinds of technologies in a real totalizing kind of a way. Well, of course, that equipment is developed and that technology is developed in the checkpoints. Why is Israel one of the world's leaders in airport security? You know, biometrics, the reading of eyes, voice recognition, body recognition, all these things that go into these modern surveillance systems, because it has millions of Palestinians every day going through checkpoints, and you can do, you know, there's magnetic tags, there's all kinds of technologies that you could use. Plus, of course, what I call the matrix of control, this model of control that Israel has developed over the Palestinians over the last 100 years, actually, that it can also export. So I think, from my point of view, that's the quid pro quo. That begins to explain things. The fact that Israel becomes a center for the export of military systems, security systems, surveillance systems, and models of control in a world, and you just have to go outside in Brussels and you can see it, that's preoccupied with security. So Israel is, in a sense, lucky in that it's able to very quickly to move into a world and become a world's leader in a world that's very preoccupied with security. So it's kind of, it's really a globalized Palestine. In other words, your police forces and security forces and militaries are being Israelized. And so we'll talk about, in terms of their weapons and their tactics and so on, which means that you, the people, are being Palestinianized. So we have a phrase, a slogan in the Israeli peace movement that we're all Palestinians. And we mean that, of course, in the sense of solidarity. But literally, you could say, we're all Palestinians in the sense that we're all today on the receiving end of the same weapons and tactics that are used on Palestinians that come into our communities in Europe. So, I mean, Danny and I were talking before, following this line, I mean, I know that Intal is working and others, the ECCP and others are working on Elbit systems and BDS around the military systems, but in a much larger way, following this military security line is a way of, in a sense, connecting up different struggles in different places. If we're all Palestinians, if all our military forces are coming together all over the world and being Israelized, in that sense, you create a kind of a solidarity and a kind of a common situation that allows us to work across borders. So I think this is an issue much larger than simply taking one piece of it, drones or Elbit or whatever. We should be looking at this at the system. Now, what I also do in my research in the book is I'm less concerned about Israel. I mean, I'm concerned about how Israel gets away with it. But beyond that, I think there's other important questions as well. And that is, using Israel as a case study, you begin to see the nature of militarization and security in the rest of the world. Now, this is an issue that the left, I think, is it's a blind spot in the left. And the military security industries in the world are a €2.5 trillion a year industry. So their impact on societies, on economies, on conflicts is huge. The largest polluter in the world is the military. I never hear the Greens talk about military as more than corporations. I mean, there's a relationship. In other words, this huge economic, technological, security control area of world politics is not on the agenda of the left. We don't have many manifestations around around certain things, around drones maybe, around a particular attack, maybe Iraq or Gaza or something, but overall it's not an issue that the left has really talked about much, and maybe it's because we don't know much about it. And I have to admit, I wrote a book about something I know nothing about. What do I know about the military? I couldn't tell you a rifle from a tank. Who knows this stuff? We're not interested in that. Most of us come from the social sciences, so we don't know science very well. So you talk to me about nano weapons or enhancing soldiers genetically. I have no idea what you're talking about. We don't know it. I think that's a big danger for us, is we don't know the technologies of control that are being developed. So when we're talking about resistance, I don't think we really know exactly what the powers that are out there that we're resisting. So partly I did in my book, and I apologize in the book, in the middle especially, where I go over weapon systems. I'll do it a little bit tonight. Just so we begin to know what these systems are, because they're not things we talk about very often. So on that level, Israel becomes a case study. It's not so Israel-focused, but it's focused on the idea of globalizing Palestine. So it's a wider process of control and securitization that I'm writing about. But there's even a higher level, because I think that we don't talk enough today about capitalism and the whole capitalist world system we live in. So even, I don't have to convince any of you, I know, but in a way, even talking about capitalism sounds old-fashioned. sounds like we're back in the 50s, you know, and who talks about, you know, and that's the success of the capitalist system, is that it's rendered itself invisible. So I was saying to Danny before, there's a joke, you know, about one fish says to another fish, "How's the water?" And the other fish says, "What water?" And that's how we are in this capitalist system. I think young people, including activists, don't perceive that they're in a system in a way. So we feel certain issues, you know, the issues, environmental issues, or women's issues, or development issues, or debt issues, or whatever, and we get involved, but we don't see where they're coming from. We don't have the bigger context anymore, partly because even talking about that bigger world system has been made weird and old-fashioned, and we don't even want to hear it, the languages. And so what I'm trying to really do also is to bring that back in a way, and to say you can't understand the logic of securitization and militarization and so on unless you understand the whole world system that it's coming from. So it's going from the very micro, Israel and the Palestinians and how it gets away with it, to looking at the role of arms in international politics, what I call security politics, and then that whole thing within the context of capitalism. So I just want to take a couple minutes and just say something about the capitalist system, just to kind of give us something to hold on to theoretically, in terms of analysis. So we're talking about, capitalism I won't get into this thing, but it's very clever in that there's a hegemony of capitalism. It's not direct rule. There's a hegemony, and with hegemony, you don't feel it very much. But it has to be enforced. Capitalism enforces its hegemony over us. So there's three aspects that are really important for the functioning of a capitalist system in terms of enforcement and control. One is military operations. I mean, countries that make up the international system that work with corporations and have their armies, and the armies are all related to each other, are very strong military forces. So you can ask the question, today you don't have any more interstate warfare like you used to have. The last real big interstate conflict was probably Korea, World War II. You've had a few little interstate wars over the years. 73 war with Israel and Egypt and Syria. Iran, Iraq. Maybe the American invasion of Iraq, although it was so asymmetrical that it's hard to talk about that as a real interstate war. The British and the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas. Maybe the Russians in the Ukraine. But again, these are very localized kinds of conflicts. Basically, you can't explain why governments are investing in weapon systems of billions of euros. Nuclear weapons, F-35 jet fighters, nuclear capable submarines, when your enemy is ISIS, Daesh, or Al-Qaeda, or Mexican drug cartels. I mean, they're not state actors. I mean, you can't fight those wars using Trident nuclear missiles. So why are they still producing them and putting all this money in? And I think the reason is that they want military. It's intimidating to everybody. It's saying, and the Americans actually say this, we want everybody to know that if they challenge either American hegemony or capitalist hegemony, we have the power to destroy them. Whether them is a non-state actor or them is China, whoever it is. So we need what the Americans call full spectrum domination. Not that we're going to use it, but it's that threat that's always there. What they actually do use to enforce their hegemony all over the world is what's called war amongst the people. This is a term that I got from a British general whose name is Rupert Smith. He's supposed to be the most intellectual British general, which is a little bit of a contradiction in terms. Who wrote a book called The Utility of Force. And he says that interstate warfare is gone. And in fact, what we're fighting today, the new paradigm of warfare, is what he calls war amongst the people. Urban warfare, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, wars, of controlling populations and people. I took that term in my book, the title, and I made it what it really is, which is war against the people. That's where the title of my book comes from. But his term is war amongst the people, which has to do with there's a whole different aspect of war. When we think about war, and we have an anti-war movement and peace, we think about war in a conventional sense. Armies and so on. But in fact, that's pretty much gone. And war is very dramatic when it happens. It's a lot of violence, a lot of death, big, sexy weapons. So, it leaves an impression. But in fact, today, war is actually policing and discipline. In other words, war today against the people is fought in Brussels. It's fought in Syria. It's fought against the Occupy movement in different places. In other words, it's fought against poor people, peoples of color, refugees, migrants, poor people, and dissidents. Those are the people that wars are fought against. In other words, anybody that's threatening to disrupt the international capitalist system. So war is actually policing. And what's interesting is we don't pay much attention to police. Police aren't as sexy as soldiers. Their weapons aren't very, police weapons, who cares so much, The police are there all the time. The police are your friends, in a way. Everybody wants security. So in some ways, people are saying, well, it's good that the police are around. So the police become an acceptable, everyday, non-issue. But in fact, that's what war is today. Whether it's class war, or wars to control populations, resource wars is one of the major forms of warfare today. Because you've got in the world this whole wide belt around the equator that's where a lot of the most valuable resources of the world are found, and the poorest populations. So the question is, how do we extract the resources but exclude those populations from the whole capitalist system? And capitalism, of course, has a built-in violence and inequality and exploitation and so on. So you need all the time, securitization, all the time, being sure that everybody is under control, and policing and discipline. This is what war is all about, but it's kind of an invisible form of war. Because, again, it's every day, and you don't have battles, you don't have big weapons like war. But, in fact, war is policing, and policing today is war. Certainly a class war. And that's why you have this idea that we know the police are being militarized. People are talking about the police being militarized. And you see the military out in the streets even. But one of the things we're not seeing is how the militaries are being policified or policized. There's not exactly a word for that. Militaries are being sent today not so much to fight wars, but they're being fought to do nation building, regime change, intervening in civil wars in different ways, more and peacekeeping operations, right? So there's much more police functions than war functions. So that this is an invisible, not very sexy, but the most important way today in which the capitalist system is enforcing its hegemony over the world system. And then you've got framing, what I call framing, based on security. And that is for most people, again, that don't feel the water, that are just living, you know, certainly in neoliberalism, you have a whole tendency of people becoming individualistic and you know, very personalized and not seeing the big picture. I think if we're not talking about capitalist world system, it's because the neoliberalism doesn't allow you to think big, to think in terms of other people and other systems, because it's all based on my own personal, it's atomizing like that. So you internalize the system. That's where the water disappears. And it has to do, of course, with ideology and patriotism and education and religion, the media, all of that. But the point is that it's based on security. So our countries are being turned into security states, where security becomes the overriding issue. Everything is subsumed to security. And of course, with security then, the governments and the powers that be have the ability to declare a state of emergency, because we're in a state of emergency. Security is our issue, and the state of emergency becomes permanent. France, I mean, I'd be surprised if after 3 months they end the state of emergency in France. Israel's been in a state of emergency since 1948. The United States has been in a state of emergency since 9/11. If you go to Kennedy Airport, you walk in and there's a big thermometer that shows you the alert level, you know, and it's always red. I mean, sometimes on July 4th it might go down to orange, but it's basically always red. So, and of course the idea of a state of emergency is fear is constant. And you can suspend all the democratic protections that you have for the sake of security. So framing becomes very, very important. Now, what's interesting, I don't want to get into this too much, but I think it's important for us to begin, even for our own work, to begin to articulate how our work and our different campaigns fit into this wider global system, because in the end, if we can't convey a bigger picture to people, they're not going to see. You know, you can convince people the drones aren't good, and you should boycott SodaStream, and women should have equal rights. Okay, but the whole what the major problems come from. You can't convey to people unless you can articulate this bigger system. So basically what's happened is, I think, until World War II, you had an expanding capitalism with imperialism, which is a term we've all used, certainly through World War II, and a little bit until the end of the Cold War. This was an expanding capitalist system. And so it went from military operations, because what it was doing was conquering lands and peoples. That was the colonialization and opening markets. And then, of course, once you colonized, you had to police them. So you have Palestinian police, and you have India, you have the Indian police in India. You take the natives and you make them the policemen over their own people. So policing became, and also, but at the same time, capitalizing them, making them into, bringing the markets in, and replacing their cultures with a market-based lifestyle, value system, and so on. And then, of course, the framing was less important in the days of colonization, because it was clear these are our primitive people. We have to civilize them. I mean, you didn't have to explain colonialism very much. It was far away, and they were enemies, or they were primitive, and so the whole system went from military this way. Today, you know, where we're in this post-war capitalism, capitalism has won, in a sense. It's conquered the world. There's nowhere in the world that isn't already brought in one way or another into the capitalist system. So today it's going the other direction. When we're trying to fight capitalism, it's not that we're fighting colonialism so much anymore, but we're fighting a much more vague kind of a thing, and that is the fact that we're fish trying to fight the water. We're trying to tell people that they're being securitized, that they're being brainwashed, that they're living in a that they're being atomized and everything else, and exploited, and without them thinking it, without them feeling that, because they've already internalized that system. So it becomes much harder. And of course, what it all is based on today, or largely, is consumerism on the one hand, but security. And everybody wants security. So part of the language that we have to use to reframe for people what's really happening is to do away with the word security. The word security is a bad word for us. It feeds us into the system. As long as we talk about security, we're buying into the way they're trying to present. Who doesn't want security? It's a problemless term. Of course I want security. Now, who's going to bring me security? My government. So it's good that they got soldiers wandering the streets with big guns, because that's for my security. If we reframe this in terms of pacification, and that's not a word we use very often in the left. Now, pacification, this is the problem, means something different in English than it does in French, I think. Even in Sweden, it was something different. Pacification means, because pacification, I don't know what it means in French, but it has maybe the connotation of, yeah, everybody being peaceful and nice and so on. In English, at least, in English, pacification means suppressing a population to the point where they can't resist anymore. They're pacified. They're simply, they can't resist. So that in that sense, if we can start to use terms like that, we're not, now, I want to be secure. Do I want to be pacified? You see? And that begins to raise critical issues. Who's pacifying me? Why are they pacifying me? How are they pacifying me? Questions that don't arise if you're using words like security. And that gets you into policing, because this is the way the capitalist system today is enforcing its hegemony. And in fact, the military that we tend to focus on is the least relevant. It's the least relevant. You don't use the military. The military, like I said, is today used as more of a threat than an actual kind of a thing. It's used in a very sporadic sort of a way. And then when it's used, like in Syria, it's not used very effectively. Because in fact, the military arsenals are not equipped for fighting the kinds of wars that are fought today. So we're focused focusing, even on the left sometimes, on the wrong issue. We're focusing on military when we should be focusing on pacification, in my view. Pacification within a capitalist system, it's not a very easy thing to sell or to communicate. Or how do you campaign it for that? I don't know. But that's, in a sense, the issue in all of this. So, going back to Israel, Israel feeds into this very, very well. I think Israel has a very good concept. And in fact, Israel's a small country. It can't produce major ships, submarines, F-35 jet fighters. It can't produce those kinds of weapons. So what it does, and this is a term that's used by the Ministry of Defense, it does niche filling. It finds the niches, the niches in military security police in the world. In other words, it looks at the whole world. And what I mean is, I'm not getting into this too much. There's three levels, maybe. One is the global north. You see, so Israel, has fought 5 or 6 conventional wars. It's very sophisticated with high-tech weapon systems. So it's able to work with NATO. It's able to work with the European. It's developing the Watchkeeper drone, which is going to be the new European drone, which is an Elbit drone. It works very closely with the U.S. and so on, and privileged access to American military technology. So on that level, it's very much a leader technologically in the global north, in conventional military things. But you've got in the world, you've heard of the BRICS. I use this term, I suppose, in French as well. BRICS, which are it's kind of a counter-hegemonic bloc. Belgium. Not Belgium. I wish. Wouldn't it be great if it was Belgium? You have a little bit of pride. At least we're. All right, Brazil is what I meant. I was thinking, Brussels and Brazil are, I was thinking, forget that. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are the BRICS countries. But now they've added to that, economic analysts and others, another bloc that are called the MINT countries, which is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. So if you take BRICS and MINT together, you have a very powerful bloc, a counter-hegemonic bloc beginning to arise. Well, Israel is super strong in every single one of those BRICS MINT countries. So you begin to understand with security politics, when you get into the world of military security, it bypasses ideologies. That's its strength. So that on the one hand, here Israel is an ally of the United States, the most loyal ally, the only democracy in the Middle East. Netanyahu goes every 3 weeks to talk to the American Congress. But Israel is the number 2 or 3 largest arms supplier to China. Well, China is the arch rival of the United States. They're moving the whole 6th Fleet into the Pacific. And here's Israel, after Russia, and France is in there as well, the number 2 or 3 arms supplier to China. So where's loyalty? What side are you see? There's no signs now. Look, Israel is number 3 or 4, from 2 to 4, depends what year, arms supplier to India. So Israel is the number 2 or 3 arms supplier to 2 of the largest militaries in the world. Not to mention, I can go on, Nigeria, Brazil, all over. So that With security politics, you bypass ideology, but with security politics, you also create a common interest around military control. I mean, all elites, all ruling classes and political elites want to keep control. That's a common interest. So if you can feed that, you know, what does it matter if it's Chinese or Indian or American or Belgium? It's the same interest. It's the same. They all want your arms and your security. You can deliver for everybody. So that you get a situation where the arms bypass ideologies. India was always pro-Palestinian. Strong, and Nigeria, strongly pro-Palestinian. But in the current situation, after the attacks on Mumbai in particular, and with Boko Haram in Nigeria, Israel is filling the niche. That's the point. Israel looks over the world and it sees what niches does the global north have, do the BRICS Min countries have, and then there's a third level, and that's the entire global south. I mean, Israel is everywhere. It's in Equatorial Guinea, it's in Peru. I mean, you go over the map, and it's very hard to find a country where Israel isn't strongly present, including Arab countries. You know, I don't know, it's not documented in Israel-Saudi military connection. Although we know that Israel's been involved in the war in Yemen. And we know that Israel and Saudi Arabia are very close politically. They both have interests against the Shia. They both have interests against the new Arab Spring breaking out. And if you remember, the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002 was formulated by Saudi Arabia. It was a Saudi peace initiative. So here's a good, now Saudi would not have done that if Israel couldn't deliver, if Israel wasn't a military security power. So that's where it bypasses it. I mean, there's no other reason why Saudi Arabia should be a friend of Israel. Normal international relations, you couldn't explain that. But if you put the military security into the picture, a whole different way of looking at the world begins to emerge. I would argue that Israel has more global reach in terms of the military and security than the United States does. You know, which sounds crazy. The Pentagon's budget is $1 trillion a year. They have 174 military bases around the world. Israel only has 2 military bases, both in Muslim countries. It's interesting. One in Eritrea and one in Azerbaijan, which is a great jump off to Iran when you need it. Otherwise, they don't have bases. But Israel is everywhere, not only militarily. You see, the Americans have bases, but they're military bases. So they're all based on McDonald's. They're all in their base during the, you know, and then they fly their airplanes or they do their ships. But you don't feel them in your country, the American bases. Israel has not only trains militaries all over, but it trains your presidential guard, your special operations unit, your security forces, your police forces. So Israel's penetration into a country is much deeper than that of the Americans. And that leads to what I call that quid pro quo. That begins to explain how Israel gets away with it. Because, you know, Israel will say to you, if you're China or India or Nigeria, you can be critical of us. It's fine. Go to the UN, criticize our occupation policies, but when it comes to a vote, when there's a critical time, we expect you to deliver. And I can give you a lot of examples of how that's actually happened. So that begins to explain not why Israel's able to keep the occupation, but I think it begins to get us into a whole area of politics that we should know more about. Now, in addition to this, all right, so what I was saying is that Israel has It fills niches. So Israel has this big conception. I mean, the thing is, we on the left, it's hard for us to talk about capitalism because it sounds old-fashioned, it sounds weird, but the capitalists talk about capitalism. You know, the militaries talk about capitalism in the world. I mean, and Israel, without a big world system view, they wouldn't be able to define the niches that they're filling. So the bad guys have this global vision, and we somehow have trouble articulating it. So there's 4 niches that Israel fills. And I'll do this really quickly. I'll skip over some stuff. One is that Israel supplies, especially to the global north, but also to the BRICS mint countries that have powerful armies, high-tech weaponry and components for weapon systems. In other words, it can't produce an F-35, but it produces the cockpit of the F-35, which is a pretty important part of the airplane, where the pilot is. The electronics, the electronic brains of the airplane, the targeting systems, the radar systems. That part is Israeli. The rest of the airplane, the Americans can build. You know? So you build components that are key to, you can't have a modern weapon system without Israeli components, basically. I mean, I don't want to overstate this either. I mean, certainly there's a lot of other technology in the world, but this is really a niche of Israel. All right, just to kind of, without getting too much in depth, just to give a bigger picture, you know, Israel it produces its own intercontinental ballistic missiles that are nuclear capable. So here, if you talk about, you know, you can criticize the occupation, but, you know, on people's minds, at least until the Paris attack, was Iran. Iran is the Iranian threat, the Iranian nuclear, well, Israel has missiles, the Jericho missile system, that's nuclear capable. Israel has probably 200 to 300 nuclear missiles, which is as much as France, more than Great Britain, right? And look at the range. Belgium is very much within the range of Israeli nuclear missiles. Iran doesn't have any nuclear missiles. Matter of fact, Iran even claims that it doesn't have a nuclear program at all in the military. So if I was the Belgian government, I mean, I'd be a little bit, here's a country, Israel, that is kind of a rogue state. Doesn't only have nuclear missiles, but it's threatened to use them. It's threatened against Iran. It's threatened to use them against Egypt. And Israel has what's called the Samson option. Seymour Hersh wrote a book about this. And that is, Israel holds its nuclear weapons as its ultimate threat to everybody. Israel says if we're going down, we're not going to go down alone. We're going to take a lot of other people with us. And it could shoot its missiles in any direction. I mean, who says it wouldn't shoot it at Belgium or at Europe? I mean, Israel certainly doesn't like Europe very much. It likes Europe as much as it likes Iran. I mean, Netanyahu a couple days ago said we want to take Europe completely out of any peace process. They're our enemies. And what's interesting is, what does it mean when Israel is facing an existential threat that would trigger its use of nuclear weapons? Well, from the Israeli government's policy is the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley on the eastern part of the West Bank, the border with Jordan, is Israel's vital security border. So I could see a scenario if the international community trying to end the occupation would say to Israel, you have to give up the Jordan Valley. Israel could consider that an existential threat. that could trigger nuclear weapons. You know, I mean, who knows in the Israeli mind what existential threat means? So if I was talk about something you can talk to Belgians about. You guys are within the nuclear range of a crazy country. And that shouldn't be a source of concern. You know, Israel does produce its own jet airplane, the Kfir, and its own tank, which is a very sophisticated tank, the Merkava, and a whole range of missile systems, from interballistic missiles to more, you know, to sea, sea to surface, surface to air, all kinds of missiles. And what's interesting here, and this gets to the idea of the occupation being a laboratory, is look how they sell it. Combat proven. Combat proven. I mean, who do they prove it on? The Palestinians, of course. So that this is what gives you the edge in the market. You have a laboratory of 4.5 million people that you can do anything with. From surveillance to Gaza, using conventional military weapons, all these sorts of things. And this is something that gives you the edge in the market. So I would say, if you can, why doesn't Israel give up the occupation? You could ask the question as well, you know, why didn't Israel accept the two-state solution 30 years ago when the PLO offered it? Well, if you look at the occupation as a resource, and not a burden, not a threat, but it's a resource. Without the occupation, would Israel be the fourth largest nuclear power in the world? Would Israel be a part of NATO? Would Israel be... No, it would be some little New Zealand, some in the Middle East or something. So that I think for its own idea of being a major military power, and the quid pro quo, for creating conditions in which it can maintain the occupation, it needs that conflict, and it needs the West Bank and Gaza as a military resource. Submarines. Here, Israel is taking delivery of 9 nuclear-capable submarines from Germany. Some of them are given to Israel as a gift. Thank you very much, Germany. And others are sold at a bargain price. So when you start to look at the Israeli arsenal, you begin to see the Palestinians are pretty irrelevant. I mean, they're not using nuclear submarines against Jenin. You know. So obviously there's here a whole military program that's more of a global one. You know, there's one Israeli nuclear submarine capable of shooting nuclear missiles, the Gabriel missiles, or Jericho, that's patrolling on in the Persian Gulf, off Iran. I don't know if it's still there. It was there a year ago. I don't know if it's... But you know, it's hard to... It's easier, let's say, to explain Iranian concerns if you know there's an Israeli nuclear submarine on its southern border than if you don't know that. These submarines are not only, you know, important. I mean, they're way too much for Israel to build. But it's the same thing I said before. Germany is building the shell. Israel couldn't do this. It doesn't have that capability. But the brains of the sub are Israeli. So here you have a whole laboratory. Imagine the billions that go into a submarine and the high-tech components and the technology and what goes into making it. And you have a little country like Israel having that opportunity to fill up 9 nuclear submarines with the most advanced high-tech technology. Whoa. That by itself will give you the edge in the market. And all kinds of other components, targeting pods, like the Iron Dome system to protect against missiles that Israel is exporting all over, and things like cyber war. Israel is one of the leaders with the United States of cyber warfare, which is a whole new form of warfare that's going on. Niche 2 are what you can call weapons of suppression. These are weapons that are used more in the wars against the people. And here again, it's interesting. There's three kinds of wars, roughly. One are what we think of as war. Conventional interstate wars, where you need nuclear missiles. I mean, use them. But you need you need the jet fighter. The conventional weapons that we've talked about. But again, that's more or less gone. So the arsenals of all our countries are irrelevant. What you do have are what are called wars against the people, hybrid wars, or we often call them asymmetrical wars, of states against non-state actors. Us against Daesh, or against Al-Qaeda, or again, the Mexican drug cartels, or all kinds of powerful non-state actors. And look at all the different kinds of terms we have for this kind of warfare today, including police operations, peacekeeping operations, and so on. This is the major form of war against the people abroad. Internally, in Brussels, in Europe, inside, are what I call securocratic wars. These are wars to keep control for the ruling classes, for capitalism in general, to keep control. So you have counterterrorism, of course, but the whole idea of war, war in a permanent way. World War II had a beginning, and you fought a war, and there was a reason, and then you won, and you had an end. Today, war on crime, war on drugs, war on terror, these are open-ended. They're permanent, you see? And it gets into homeland security, and the state of emergency, and policing and discipline. So this becomes the class war that's being fought through securitization. Well, if this is the form of warfare today, wars against the people, this is exactly the niche that Israel has carved out. More than any other. I mean, it's not that other countries don't have pieces of this, but Israel has put it together so that if you're the United States, or you're Europe, and you're fighting Daesh, or you're fighting non-state actors, you go to Israel for your tactics and your weapons and your, and your strategies and so on, because Israel has fought these wars against the Palestinians for 100 years. So they have the experience and the weaponry that the large capitalist countries don't have. So all these would be fought by what we call weapons of repression or weapons of suppression. All right, I won't get into the whole thing, but spy satellites. I mean, from outer space that keep control. I mean, these are like super drones. You worry about drones, but you're being surveyed all the time by space. Israel is one of the 7 countries in the world that has the capability of launching a satellite on its own. And it launches them from either Azerbaijan or India. So you begin to see those connections as well. They have a series today of 9 OFIC spy satellites and communications. So you have that dual use issue, that they're both for civilian use and also for military. Well, your Facebook just paid $100 million to an Israeli military company to have access to OFIC 10 that's going to be launched in the next couple of years, that will give Facebook access to Africa and parts of the world where it doesn't have access today. So here's a direct connection between your personal Facebook and Israeli military and global pacification. And there's technologies that we don't really know much about that are so scary that it's like science fiction. I talk about this and my friends in the left laugh because it doesn't sound real. the army has a concept of swarm bots, or nano warriors, or nanobots. Bots would be robots. So, for example, in nanotechnology, nanoweaponry, there's a concept of smart dust. It's like dust. So let's say I want to find someone in Brussels or in Gaza. I can spray an area like you do with a crop duster, that goes over fields and spreads, fertilizer, it kills weeds, it kills insects. You can spray in an invisible dust. It's dust. A whole city or a whole area. But the particles of dust are actually nanosensors. A nano is a billionth of a meter. They're nanosensors, so I can program your DNA into these sensors, spray it over an area, and where you are will pop up from your DNA. I can find anybody anywhere. I can also program these sensors to kill. For example, you can use this smart dust, that's called. Smart from the point of view that it's figuring out stuff. I can program nano dust to attack an entire population's nervous system. I can paralyze the whole population. I can target parts of the brains of an entire population, make a whole population forget, for example. So we're talking about technologies that are we're right at the edge of them being used. I mean, they're there. And of course, one of the leaders if we want a good BDS target, we've talked about this, is the Technion, which is Israel's largest polytechnic. It's the largest laboratory of the Israeli army. One of their major areas of research is nano-weapon. Israel is the world's leader in the military applications of nanotechnology. Italy, France, and other places use nanotechnology in a biomedical way. So it has a positive image in the public. But in fact, they're connecting up to Israel. So that the military uses of nanotechnology, that are many, are being spread. It's a technology we don't know much about. I don't know much about it. I mean, I'm not presenting myself as an expert. I don't know any of this stuff. I know maybe this much more than you do, because I wrote this book. But I think it's, again, a blind spot on the left, that we don't know these systems of control. Drones we know about. 40% of the drones of the world are Israeli. And the drone technology is largely Israeli. And all kinds of weapons of urban warfare. This is the Merkava tank, but it's the LIC. What does that mean? Low intensity conflict. So these are the kinds of weapons that are sent into Gaza. And Jenin and Palestinian cities and beyond. Not to mention the Caterpillar bulldozers that are used in house demolitions. It's hard for me to talk about weapons of repression without talking about house demolitions. The D9 weaponized bulldozer produced by Caterpillar for the Israeli army, which is a very powerful machine. It's a mining, they use it in mines, but it's been custom made for the Israeli army. Look at the size of this machine. And what Caterpillar has done with Israel, the problem is, if you hit a building in Gaza, let's say an apartment building, with a normal bulldozer, the building will fall on the driver and kill him. So they've designed the shovel with the Israeli army in a way that when it hits a building, it falls away from the driver. So these are weapons used specifically for demolishing Palestinian homes and buildings. This is the Jenin refugee camp after Operation Defensive Shield 2002. And it has another piece of it as well, and that's this hydraulic hook. So you shove the hook into the pavement of a city, Ramallah, Nablus, Gaza City, wherever you are, and you drive up and down the streets with this powerful bulldozer, uprooting all the infrastructure, the electrical lines, the telephone lines, the sewage system, everything. So you can destroy the infrastructure of a city with this kind of a bulldozer. That's a weapon of repression. The third niche are models of securitization. And I'm talking about the matrix of control that Israel has developed in the West Bank and Gaza that's been globalized. I won't get into this again, but robotic weapons, like this robot system that patrols the border of Gaza. So when you hear about 5 Palestinian farmers have been killed today in Gaza as they get close to this buffer zone, they were killed by soldiers sitting in Tel Aviv. You don't need soldiers on the border because everything is robotized. These are robot weapon systems. And again, this whole issue of surveillance that Israel's developed, especially on the Palestinians, especially at checkpoints. Nice systems, as I mentioned, is taking over whole cities in this form. And what's interesting is, what's the greatest threat to the human security state? And I took this from the NICE website, basically. What's the greatest threat that our security states are facing? Spaces of anonymity. That's what they call it. If the state doesn't know where you are, and who you're talking to, and what you're thinking, it feels very anxious. So the whole idea of these systems is to eliminate any spaces of anonymity, privacy in societies. This has to do not with security, you see, but it has to do with pacification. And that should be a message that we're conveying to the public. Drones aren't only drones, the big drones, but there's micro drones. So the Technion in particular specializes in mimicking insects or mimicking birds and creating drones, again, with poisons or for surveillance that are super small. How's this for a drone? Huh? That's equipped with a poison. Or weaponizing insects themselves. So the technologies really become amazing when you get down to the level of nano. And of course, working with police forces. That is an Israeli thing. For example, a corner shot. Israel's developed a rifle that shoots around corners so that the police don't have to be exposed when they're shooting. I won't get into that, but the last niche is this framing and what Israel calls lawfare. And that's, again, Israel's aware of how crucial framing is. Because in the end, that's another way Israel gets away with it. Israel is seen, for all the occupation and repression, Israel is seen by many as the only democracy in the Middle East, as the good guy against the bad guys, as the Western civilization, all these things. So framing becomes a key part of this whole system. That's why we have to learn how to reframe. But look, after Operation Defense Cast Lead in 2008 and 2009 in Gaza, the Chinese sent the spokesman of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Those of us that still think China is into liberation. Their spokesman to Israel to learn how the Israeli army sold cast lead to the public. I mean, if China can sell Tibet in the way that, or the Uyghur issue of the Muslims in Western China, the way Israel sells it and gets away with Gaza, well, and all kinds of other ways of framing. How's this? It operates drones during the day and lights Hanukkah candles at night. Here's a soldier with a drone, and of course the use of women, soldiers, women soldiers in khaki bikinis with rifles, and so on. So to end this, you know, I've gotten to the point, I guess, with all the different struggles that I've been through, of saying I want to start to jump to the big issue. I mean, we have our campaigns, and it's important we have our campaigns about Palestine, about women, and about the climate, and about, I mean, all these are all important issues. But somewhere, some of us have to step back and look at the bigger system that this is all coming from, and to try to strategize in ways that we're both conveying what that system is to our activists and to people, and also to join our campaigns that are already coming from the same problems in a way that we're not doing it today. So just, you know, what I'm trying to say is there's a hegemony of transnational capital today. That's the problem. We all know it's not sustainable. We all know it's violent. I mean, even people out in the street kind of know it. They're feeling it, at least, certainly with the climate change issue and so on. But we're not articulating where we should be going, I think, as the left, very well. So, it's not only this hegemony, but again, it's enforced by the military and war against the people and the framing. So we have to fight, we have to develop strategies. How do you fight these? You know, one is to resist military operations where they are, and to show how irrelevant they are in terms of actually changing things. War amongst the people to show that it's not security. It's not really, you're not really security. The military in the street here isn't really for our security, but rather it's repressive. And what it's leading to is a permanent state of emergency in which we're going to be pacified. That's really the meaning. You know, they're using the attack on Paris, of course, as that trigger, but it has a much deeper and permanent meaning, the securitization, and to show that, and to in the framing, to re-articulate in terms both of pacification, but what kind of, and I'm talking, I mean, maybe I should call it socialism, although we all have a different idea of what socialism is. But where we should be going as a movement on the left is toward articulating some kind of at least what I'm calling a human-centric hegemony. A hegemony of a world system in which human beings and their needs are primary. And we're not doing that. So we're sort of up here somewhere. We haven't dealt with how we're dealing with the violence of the system, and we haven't dealt with what are we suggesting to people. So I think this whole line of research and this whole line of thinking leads to some very interesting conclusions for the left in general. And I'll leave it at that. Did I stay more or less within the hour? An hour and all right, so discussion.
If anyone has questions, comments.
Discussion. Okay, good night.
Just a little bit, there was, I think in some previous slides, you mentioned something about state of exception or...
The state of emergency.
No exception, I think.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether the...
That's right. Unexceptional spaces.
But above the people's exception?
That's our states of exception. People, in other words, what are these surveillance systems? You know, they're all based on algorithms, these security systems. They're not, it isn't that you have the cameras. You see the cameras all over. It isn't that they're photographing, and when a crime happens, you go over the tapes and you find out who it was and you arrest them. That's not really the point of it. First of all, it's digitalized. So you don't have to go over hours. Everything is right there. You just put in what you want to know. And they build portfolios on all of us. It's surveilling all the time as you're walking down the street. So it has your everything, again, like I mentioned, your body type, if you have particular gestures, your voice, your eyes, it has things that are called micro expressions that we're not that are involved. We're not even aware of them. When we're planning something happy, something bad, something evil, whatever it is, our faces reflect it in certain ways that we're not even aware of. You can't really have a blank face. And it picks up those things. And it simply records them. So now you're getting to a concept of crime prevention, which is different from the traditional. Crime prevention usually meant we're following the bad guys, and we know when a drug deal is going to happen, and we're going to be there, we're going to prevent it, we're going to grab it. Crime prevention here means predicting who's going to do a crime. In other words, they take all your movements, and they know where you've been, and they know where you're going, and they know where you're going before you know where you're going. Because they know your patterns and so on. And if your pattern indicates that and this is the point, that you're an exception. The algorithm says almost everybody more or less acts in a normal way. You know, you follow patterns, and you go here, you go there, and you look a certain way, and you do this and that. So the system just lets you go. But any exception, a state of exception. In other words, you're meeting people every day in a certain place. Yeah, most people don't do that. Or people of exception. Half of you are people of exception. People of color, refugees, poor people, dissidents maybe. What's a dissident? Whatever you put in, somebody with long hair, somebody with a beard. Spaces of exception. Where refugees hang out, where poor people hang out, where you have demonstrations maybe. Universities would certainly be a place of exception. So you have, for example, in Britain today, there's a program called Prevent, where students and faculty are required to report on anything they hear in the classroom, and this is almost the language, I'm almost quoting. Anything, any expression that could conceivably lead to extremism. Whoa. You see? But that's an exception. They're looking for, because if you could just, 99.9% of everybody's behavior just goes under the radar. But the exceptions, the people, the spaces, the interactions get picked up. And then you can begin to preventive detention and so on, taking preventive actions even before people, they're defined as exceptional and therefore they're dangerous, even before they've actually planned anything or done anything. So it's a very scary kind of a system, and what makes it scarier is that it's based on algorithms and things. It's not a personal kind of a thing.
So you had an underlying message all along that, if I understand you correctly, and that's the question, so that the left, which I understand is the radical left and not the Democratic Party.
Whatever.
Yeah. No, because so it should speak more about capitalism, directly about capitalism. But then you were.
But especially about the enforcement of capitalism, how it's.
So but that's what's your, because you were co-animating the committee for house demolition, which is a very specific topic.
That's right.
And then here this is a lot of leftist people, but it's not specifically an anti-capitalist movement. And I assume if Intal would become the Communist Party of Belgium, it would lose a big part of its members. So what do you mean? Do you mean that that we
Right.
should put words like capitalism, liberalism, or I don't know, socialism
Right.
more into the messages of such movements, or what's your message?
I don't know. Communist parties today are changing their names
Yeah.
to other
Yeah.
things. You know that, but that's the point. I don't have an answer to that. I didn't come to say this is. I'm saying this is. We should begin to connect the dots of our different campaigns. We should begin to relate to the source of the problem, which is the capitalist system, and we have to frame it in a certain way. Now, how do we frame it? Do we use? It's a good question. I mean, that's what we should have discussions about. Should we use the word capitalist?
Frame means define, or what?
Framing means how do you present it? I mean, should you use the word capitalism? And I could see people saying, yes, you should, because that gives the name to what the system is. And other people would say, no, because it's a loaded term and you'll turn people off and maybe we should be talking about something else. Those are questions, I don't, there's no answer to that. But I think that's something we should be talking about on the left. How do we're not very good, apparently, at getting our analyses out to people. Because of our language, we're not framing it in the right way. We're not somehow, I mean, if you look, I don't know, I just think, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who's actually on our board. Jeremy is on the board of the Palestine Solidarity Committee in the UK. So here's a real left guy, who all of a sudden, it turns out, is really, unexpectedly, is really saying things that the people want to hear. Nobody would think, because in most countries, a Jeremy Corbyn would never have a chance to become the head of a party. But how do you know? So it turns out that our issues are issues that people do care about. And he happened to find a way to frame it and get himself into a position where he's changing the discourse in the UK in a way that the left was never able to do overall. So I'm saying that we have openings here. We have issues, we have that people care about, but somehow we're not presenting them in the right way, and we're not putting our campaigns together. It's very fragmented. And so when I come to speak on, maybe even tonight, when I come to speak, usually the splinter of the left interested in Israel-Palestine comes. Nobody else comes. And that's, I think, I can understand that we have to also divide our labor. We can't do everything, but at the same time, we've got to have a meta approach.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I apologize because I missed the first 20 minutes of your presentation. It was not easy to find. I have two questions, two contradicting questions. The first one, after the last war in Gaza, I hear the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany saying that Hamas should dismantle military infrastructure. We're talking about primitive rockets.
Right. Put up your voice a bit.
Yeah.
We're recording.
About primitive rockets that Hamas is shooting from Gaza
Right.
to Egypt. And at the same time, you just for us images of 5 nuclear-capable submarines
That's right.
offered by Germany
That's right.
to Israel.
That's right.
But at the same time, you want to dismantle the military infrastructure
That's right.
of Hamas. The first question is, and also you show an image with the range of the Israeli Jericho missile
right.
program.
That's right.
And if we agree that the threat comes immediately to Israel from the Middle East countries,
Right.
why Israel needs missiles where it could hit the United States and Belgium with that?
Right.
We agree that the source of tension is the Middle East,
Right.
the Arab world and Iran.
Right.
So why do they need these long-range missiles to target even the United States? The second question.
Wait, let me answer that, because that was 2 questions. Wait, let me just answer that before you go on. One has to do with this whole issue of why do they demand that Hamas demilitarize or stop, whereas Israel can have nuclear missiles, and that's fine. And that gets into this whole discourse about terrorism that you're going to do your dissertation, your work on. Again, framing and language becomes important, and we have to be sensitive to that. The word terrorism is only applied to non-state actors. States, by definition, can't be terrorist, because states, the whole definition of a state is that you have a legitimate monopoly over the use of force. So you can have a state like Hitler's Germany that does terrible things, and it can do war crimes, and you can be bad, and you can have bad policies, but you never call Hitler or Stalin or anybody a terrorist. Bush or Obama, you never call any of them a terrorist, even though they've killed millions of people, because they had states. So that the very use of the word terrorist is loaded. The minute you say terrorist, you're blaming. Now, I'll just say something really interesting. There's a guy named Rummel, not the German one, Rummel, that wrote a book called Death by Government. And he has a very interesting website. And he estimates that over the course of the whole 20th century, about 170,000 innocent people were killed by what we would call terrorists, non-state actors, which is a lot of people, and it's not a good thing. But, he says, over the course of the 20th century, somewhere between 170 and 350 million innocent people were killed by states. By states in different ways. So if you look at the death of innocent people, which is in a way the definition of terrorism, states are much more culpable than all the non-state actors. But they're not held into accountability. So I think that's a really good example of how we have to begin to play with framing, with language. So people begin to, because the language leads you to look at things in a certain way. So I think on the left we should have a kind of a, we shouldn't be using their language, and we should begin to talk in a language that's more, that's more critical, that exposes what's going, instead of that. Just the other part of it, real quickly, is that Israel uses weapons, I think, for the same reason that the United States and Europe does. It's for intimidation, basically. The idea is we're the hegemon, and in the Middle East certainly, and we have the power to do bad things if you cross us. So they're meant to be threats more than actual weapons. Let me come back to you, okay? And okay. We'll come back. You have a question?
Yeah, I think what you're saying about the failure of the left to really address people in a layman's language, etc., or the failure of the left to develop this meta-narrative, I guess the moment you start doing it, you're immediately accused of conspiracy theory.
That's right.
And I find it very hard to, at the same time, develop this meta analysis without immediately falling into this idea that there's a big brother out there that is coordinating all these interests, etc. And I think a second problem is that we don't address the language of affect and the reality that people are scared. So how do you address fear? And I have lots of friends who are leftists, but who say, well, I'm scared for my kids, and so, I'm not sure if there's a terrorist threat, but better be safe than sorry. This kind of idea. And how, as a leftist, how can the left address this kind of very humane feeling? I guess.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, first of all, it's true that you have to be careful of conspiracy theory, and we have a lot of that in the left and other places. I don't know, because on the one hand, I mean, again, it has to do with how you present it. It's clear that there isn't one ruling class and one set of people that are determining everything. But at the same time, it's also true that there is a ruling class, and there are dominant interests, and there are, governments that work closely with militaries, and they have agendas. I mean, the agendas are there. So the question is, it's true, how do you say that, without sounding conspiratorial? And we have to find ways to do it, because that is the reality. But at the same time, you can't be simplistic about it. I mean, the trick is, how do you convey a complex, nuanced, as we would say, reality in language that people can still get? One thing that we're doing, Anita and I are involved in a project in which we're, just to show you real quick, in which we're trying to set up almost kind of an online museum of the way the world is working. Where you look at different aspects, like a landscape, because all these go in the financial scape of the world, the power scape, the technoscape, the war scape, and so on. And we're trying to take all this stuff about weapons and capitalism and policing, everything we've talked about, and put it into, make like an online museum where people can go in and they can begin to learn about. Personally, one strategy, if I could just say, is museums. I love museums. And millions of people go to museums. Museums have the ability to take complex things and break them down without simplifying, break it down into pieces that people can not just digest, but can interact with. Museums are very creative, so you're going through, they're fun, they're interesting, you're putting things together, and museums are able to present provocative issues in ways that aren't threatening to people. Kids will come to an exhibit of something that they would never allow a speaker to come into the classroom to talk about. So, that's one strategy. What if there was a museum, the critical history of, there is one museum, a little bit like that, in Manchester. It's called the People's Museum. Manchester is where Engels lived, of course. And it was just a very good museum. But it's British-oriented, towards the whole history of socialism, but within a British context. There's a couple like that, but or a museum of, what I'd love to have is a museum of civil society. What have normal, everyday people done over the centuries, all over the world, to produce progressive social change? Not just Gandhi, Mandela, Martin Luther King, but there's a lot of people all over that aren't acknowledged and we don't know. And for young people, that would really empower them, because the idea is that you can change things. Even if you're coming in if you're don't have any power in an isolated situation, there's a lot of examples. So that's just one way of, of strategically saying, do we need counter institutions of our own? Why don't we have museums? Why don't we have our own universities? Why don't we have, you do have here to some degree a community-based frame. Why aren't there more places? We could never have a place like this in Israel. We just don't have, we're so isolated, the left in Israel, that we don't even have an office, our organization. So, yeah, those are some of the issues. And how you present those sorts of things. And then, of course, it's always the case that you have to show people the context. So one of the things we can do in this, one of the ideas, for example, is what if people took, like you have avatars in games. What if people took on, what if you had a refugee, or different refugees from different places, and you went through this capitalist militarist system as a refugee? So you're starting from what you're saying, from the personal. Here's a person, a refugee, displaced, just a story. But as you trace that person's, where do they come from? Why do they leave? What's going on? You back into the same capitalist system. In other words, your friend who's scared about her kid is in fact the victim of a system that's encouraging and violence and not allowing people to stay, generating these kinds of conflicts. But people don't see it. They stop at a certain level. They see the actual attack. And most people don't have another way of explaining except these are bad guys. Or they're primitive, or they're savages. In the French newspapers, it was the barbarians. I mean, that's the language of the ruling classes. That's their language, and it's very effective. Why can't we develop a counter language? So when these things happen, we're ready, and we have a counter. Why don't we have our newspapers? I mean, there's all kinds of issues that this brings up. If we really want to be effective, that would lead us to beginning to strategize in ways that we're not today. Okay.
I have a question or a comment because you described a lot how technology is being exported from Israel outside. But I think it's also important to understand, and you touched about it a bit, for example, the case of multinational companies, mainly American-based, that are also profiting from the Israeli occupation, like you showed Caterpillar. And there is HP that is profiting a lot from the checkpoints, from the technologies they sold to the Israeli military to operate in the checkpoints. And we here in Intal, we campaign against G4S. Of course.
That's right.
And we see that also this money is also coming back, for example, in the US, there was a recent report about big donors that have a big financial interest in the Israeli occupation that are donating for the anti-BDS, all this kind of propaganda, Zionist propaganda group in American campuses. And they have lots of finance, and it comes from people like also Edelson and Moshkovitz and the Jewish billionaires, but also non-Jewish billionaires like the Koch brothers.
The Koch brothers.
Yeah, so we have this also export, but also import, and we have this kind of network of interest that is operating to maintain the occupation in place.
That's right. And it's a network. And that's, if I would, I got some criticism of the presentation, which is good. And one of the criticisms is that it's too state-oriented, which is true. I'm talking about Israel, but in fact, what you're saying is really true, that there's a flow. I mean, Israeli companies are subsidiaries of American company. Shell Oil isn't really Dutch. In a lot of, and then the technologies interact, and it's hard to define what's an Israeli military product, and where it goes, and then you have the dual use issue. So we have to look, and that's part of what we could be doing as well. We have to look at the global flows, and be less state-centered or Europe-centered or whatever, and really begin to show the flows that are happening to people. Because there is a country called global in a way, and we should kind of show how it works and who's ruling it. And then in a sense, if you take an image like that, there's a country called global, then you could talk about a ruling class. You have a ruling class, or you have a government in Belgium. So why can't you transpose the idea of a government in Belgium to there's a government kind of global? And then you look at Davos, and you look at the corporations, and you look at those. So you begin to put it in terms that people are familiar with. And I think that's, so I think it's true. We have to look at the flows, not at the particular countries.
Can I briefly add?
Maybe two more, and then
No, just You started your presentation by saying, and I didn't note it, by saying it is a youth market.
Yes.
The whole defense and security
That's
system
right.
is a very youth. That means that there's a lot of interest behind it.
Exactly.
That to make profit and to make profit for, I think, for financial groups and
That's right.
and I see a link also with your question about saying how can we frame it that people understand what we want to say. That is that there is a direct link between youth profit making and what Israel does, and that people are victim also of this way of this system that is making huge profits
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
And that is also the global, one of the big issues now in Belgium is the trade agreement between United States and Europe, TTIP.
Yeah. That's right.
So this is a big issue.
That's right.
We are also seeing that climate destruction is most of the time in favor of making profit.
That's right.
So there is a common understanding that we can develop that all these teams are linked and they have a source.
That's right. No, I think we have the analysis to some degree, but somehow we're not succeeding in framing, if you will, the analysis in a way that's people can really grasp. You know, that's maybe part of the problem.
Yes, I found your explanation very interesting, but I have one thing that's not so clear. Israel was created by colonialism to have a military platform in the Middle East where there is oil and so on. So the role of Israel, is it still the same, and now the West give them the knowledge of technologies to be able to stand in that place,
Yeah.
or has it nothing to do with that?
No, I think it still has to do with that. Israel is a surrogate for Western interests. I mean, Israel says that. You know, that we're your bastion in the Middle East for American policy or, Western policies and so on. I mean, that's also one of the ways in which Israel, of course, sells itself to the West, is that we're your actor in, in the Middle East. So that Israel's been very involved, everything from opposing the Arab Spring, it sent crowd control equipment to Mubarak in those days, to obviously trying to deal with Iran in different ways. I mean, in all kinds of ways. And Israel has a global reach. For example, Nigeria changed its vote in the UN to support Israel a couple of years ago when there was a resolution on Palestine in the Security Council, not only because of Boko Haram, but because Israel is key in defending in protecting the Shell oil gas rigs off the coast of Nigeria. So I mean, Israel, for example, is the leader in the anti-piracy of Israeli companies that are the anti-pirate companies off the coast of Somalia. I mean, Israel has managed to parlay that's why I'm saying globalizing Palestine. It's able to generalize from the Palestinians and both present things. For example, when the Paris attacks happened, Israel right away is saying, now you know what we're going through. So immediately generalizing. But to go to different countries and to say, you have your problems with your oil rigs in Nigeria. Well, we're great at perimeter protection because look at how we defend the settlements in the West Bank. Or look how good we've defended our airports. Or here we're defending airports all over the world. We can defend your oil rigs. So they're able to parlay that their expertise in specific things into a more generalized So Israel really does deliver. Now, and let me say one more thing. Maybe I'll let you say your last question. One more thing real quick, and that is I'm not trying to, and it's important to say this, I'm not trying to say all this to scare us. I mean, the message isn't, this is technology that's going to control us, so we might as well go home and hide. You know, I mean,
There's no way to
the message is, of course, that we have, if we're going to resist, we have to know what we're resisting. We have to know, I'm trying to lay it out but you know, you can also look at the fact that Israel hasn't pacified the Palestinians. Not even Gaza. I mean, with all this stuff we're talking about Israel and the technology and the effectiveness and this and that, you know, Gaza still is resisting. This little, you know, island is still resisting. The Palestinians are still resisting. And, you know, the global north hasn't done very well against a lot of resistance movements. So this is another thing that I think the left has to develop. And that is, what spaces of resistance can we carve out? How do we, if you have a system that's, and they know what they're doing, a surveillance system that tries to eliminate states of exception, well, that's exactly what we have to try to create. It's a state of exception that's a state of resistance. So how do we organize and create spaces of resistance in a system that they're totalizing? So it's kind of a challenge, for us. But there are spaces, and they haven't succeeded, so well. So there's a kind of I see it as a challenge to try to do that. So Israel's very effective, but it's not. It hasn't. The Palestinians that don't even have an army have still been fairly effective in resisting. Last, if you want.
Yes, but I don't know if it's easy to answer that question. But as you said in your presentation, that the Western countries, mainly the United States and Germany, is delivering weapons to Israel, and at the same time, Israel is delivering weapons to the enemies of those countries, mainly China.
Yeah, that's right.
You take the money of poor people in the United States, you give it to Israel, and Israel gives its weapons to your enemies. How can you explain that? It's a strange behavior. When you support Israel against the Palestinians, okay, I can understand that. I can explain it. It's not good. But when you just give Israel lots of weapons, and Israel at the same time is giving your enemies weapons.
That's right. Then you have specific explanations for things. In the United States, Israel's source of support is Congress, not the administration. So Israel feels it can do anything it wants to do, and Congress will support it. So, this thing with China got very serious in the early 2000s. I should tell you how serious. There was, in the Bush administration, Bush the son, the Assistant Secretary of Defense was Richard Pearl, who was a Jewish neocon, super pro-Israel. And when Israel started to transfer this military technology of the Falcon surveillance craft, that's American surveillance to China, Richard Pearl, the Jewish pro-Israel neocon, threatened that the United States would cut off diplomatic ties with Israel if it didn't stop. It got to that point, and Israel in fact did stop on that particular thing. They didn't transfer that technology, and they had to fire the Director General of the Ministry of Defense, that until today is not allowed to go to the United States, Yaron. And so there are times in which Israel is confronted by the U.S. But basically, Israel simply is uncritically supported by Congress. So it doesn't care if it pisses off the administration, because it's, in the end, Congress is the one that supports it. So it has a lot of latitude. It's true, it can get to a point where it's got to pull back once in a while, but very seldom. Anyway, I hope this was useful.